Just weeks before his all but guaranteed re-election, Russia's President Vladimir Putin gave his own version of a State of the Union address today. As Nick Schifrin reports, Putin used the occasion to show off new weapons that he says can defeat U.S. missile defenses and maintain a deadly balance with the United States.
President Vladimir Putin today unveiled a grand vision for his country's future, and what he called the means to achieve it: new nuclear weapons.
No one wanted to speak with us constructively. No one has listened to us. You listen to us now.
He showed off animations of weapons he called invincible, a hypersonic missile apparently capable of crossing continents in seconds, and a never-before-acknowledged nuclear-powered cruise missile, apparently that can slalom between missile defense systems that Putin considers a long-term threat. It's not clear the weapons even exist, but Putin said he wasn't bluffing.
Any use of nuclear weapons against Russia and its allies will be perceived as a nuclear attack on our country. The response will be immediate.
Our nuclear triad.
Putin's return to Cold War rhetoric comes 1 month after the U.S. announced its own plans to deploy new nuclear weapons and greater willingness to use nuclear weapons. Putin said he was responding to American threats.
The growing military strength of Russia is a secure guarantee of peace because this strength preserves and will always preserve a balance of power in the world.
To no surprise, Russian lawmakers responded with praise. They said Putin once again made Russia a global superpower.
Vladimir Putin's State of the Nation address has sent parts of the media into a frenzy, accusing Russia of Cold War-era posturing. During the speech, the president showcased the country's new strategic weapons, which he said could outsmart all existing missile defenses.
The White House and the country learning of that new threat from Russian President,
warning his adversaries, and in the West in particular, not to mess with Russia.
Computer graphics of missiles flying over mountains and heading over oceans.
And he says he's not bluffing.
Though many saw the address as a threat directed at the United States, Moscow claims it has no intention of using its military might. The high-tech weaponry is intended only to preserve the global balance of power, as Murad Gazdiev reports.
If you aren't Russian, the first hour of Putin's speech would have been boring. Taxes and corruption, science and industry, that sort of thing. After that, though, it got real hot, real fast.
Russia is a major nuclear power, but basically nobody wanted to talk to us. Nobody listened to us. So, listen to us now.
Rockets, lasers, nukes in a rush. Putin unveiled an arsenal of new weapons, bigger, faster, stronger, and deadlier than any that came before.
The theory about Russia as a regional superpower with a weak economy disappears from the American political thinking.
The speech took place just over 2 weeks before the Russian elections. Putin framed the U.S. as an adversary and himself the only leader strong enough to meet the challenge.
This was a Merry Christmas from Vladimir Putin. The Russian military says it launched a long-range, nuclear-capable hypersonic missile, which hit its target 4,000 miles away near the border with Kazakhstan. Now, hypersonic missiles can travel 20 times the speed of sound, making them a challenge for any U.S. missile defense systems. And as you mentioned, Russian President Vladimir Putin witnessed the launch firsthand. He called the test an excellent New Year's gift to his nation.
The new avant-garde missile system is invincible for today's and future air defense systems and missile defense systems. This is a big success and a big victory.
Putin says he will deploy this type of missile next year, but he wasn't the only one watching today. U.S. officials tell me American spy satellites orbiting the Earth also witnessed the launch.
This just in from Moscow. President Vladimir Putin says Russia is now ready to deploy a new hypersonic nuclear missile as soon as next year. This is all according to Reuters. This is some new video from the Russian government, and it appears to show officials test firing that new weapon today. Putin said in part, quote, "This test, which is just finished, ended with complete success. From next year, 2019, Russia's armed forces will get the new intercontinental strategic system Avangard. It's a big moment in the life of the armed forces and in the life of the country. Russia has obtained a new type of strategic weapon." All of this coming as the U.S. prepares to pull out of the intermediate range nuclear forces treaty with Russia.
U.S. defense officials say this is the real deal. Russia test firing its new high-speed hypersonic missile, a missile that the U.S. military currently cannot defend against. Russian President Vladimir Putin pulling no punches on his intent.
The new avant-garde missile system is invincible against today's and future air and missile defense systems of the potential enemy. This is a big success and a great achievement.
If the weapons work as advertised, there is no current defense against them.
NBC News foreign correspondent Lucy Kavanaugh, she is in London with a little bit more on the significance of this new weapon. Lucy, what can you tell us?
Hey, Craig. Well, I would take this news with a giant grain of salt. The Russians have been trying to develop a hypersonic weapon system for a while now. Folks at the Pentagon have been concerned but also skeptical about their ability to do so successfully. If you remember back in March, Putin had this big press conference where he unveiled a whole host of different new weapons, including this avant-garde missile system. That's what they're calling it. It's an intercontinental range missile, which the Russians claim, and again, we have no way of verifying this, travels at either 5 to 20 times the speed of sound. They say it can withstand temperatures of nearly 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Putin previously touted this thing as invincible because there's no missile defense system for something flying at hypersonic speed. So they say they carried out a test of this thing today. The Russians say this avant-garde glider missile was launched from a military base in the southern Ural Mountains, nearly 4,000 miles away. Russian television showed footage of something being launched. They released video of Putin watching the whole thing from a Ministry of Defense control room. I know you're seeing the footage right there on the screen. The Russian president, as you say, Craig, claiming the launch was a success. He says the first regiment armed with missiles carrying these avant-garde gliders will be deployed in Russia next year. But again, it's just not something that we can verify. The threat of this kind of missile is that you can't really defend against it, so it is an escalation of tensions by Russia, but it's an escalation that we've seen for some time now in a variety of spaces. There was that brazen Russian attack on Ukrainian ships in the Kerch Strait. Some experts say that was Putin's way of testing NATO to see how the alliance will respond. And I think the Russian leader is basically looking to see how the Trump administration responds to this latest escalation. They have wanted to develop this weapon system for a while. There's been questions about their ability to do so. Whether they actually did what they say they did, we don't know. The only thing we can say with certainty, Craig, is that this is an escalation in tensions.
And what are they saying at the Pentagon?
Dana, they say that the U.S. military does very similar tests. About 4 times a year, the U.S. Air Force launches intercontinental ballistic missiles from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, which travel 4,000 miles into the South Pacific. Now, the officials here say these hypersonics are nothing to worry about because the U.S. military has its own hypersonics it's working on, and it tests them, and they are coming. The same officials say, why would the Russians or anybody like the Chinese launch a missile at the United States when the U.S. military has its own nuclear arsenal? Like these Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines, which carry 24 Trident D5 ballistic missile. Each of these missiles have multiple independent warheads. A number of these boomers are underwater at all times, capable of launching nuclear missiles at hundreds of cities around the world. The U.S. also has 400 nuclear missiles in the ground in Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming, and nuclear bombers as well. But a recent report by military experts and former senior military officers warned the U.S. is falling behind. Quote, with respect to hypersonics in particular, the United States finds itself trailing China and perhaps Russia as well. All this raises the possibility that America may find itself at a technological disadvantage in future conflicts. And one of those report's authors recently spoke to Fox News.
We are seeking to remain the preeminent military power in the world, which means we have to do 5 things at once. We need to be able to continue the fight against terrorism like ISIS. We have to deter Iran and North Korea. We have to continue to counter Russian aggression. And of course, we have to deal with the pacing threat that we face in a resurgent China.
The Russian missile has captured the attention of Patrick Shanahan, the Deputy Defense Secretary, who will take over as acting Pentagon chief when Secretary James Mattis leaves next week. Shanahan warns the U.S. needs to be able to detect the fast-flying missile much further away than current radar systems can handle. The U.S. has to detect it thousands, not hundreds of miles away because of its high-speed approach. The Pentagon may spend more than $1 billion trying to develop and field its own capabilities.
We have a number of options going on with hypersonic missiles.
The Russians are making significant yet unproven claims about their missiles, saying it's capable of carrying a nuclear warhead. It flies up to 20 times faster than the speed of sound. It can adjust altitude and direction to avoid detection. Putin says it's invincible.
We're going to need a different set of sensors in order to see the hypersonic threats. Our adversaries know that.
The challenges are also political for President Trump, whose relationship with Russian President Putin has been rocky since July's Helsinki summit.
Putin feels incredibly emboldened. Putin believes this is the time to press his advantage. He's put his forces in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. He's, of course, taken over Crimea. He's now gaining ground in Syria. This is Russia's time, in his view.
Now, because the Russians are putting so much effort into this new missile, the U.S. is responding by funding its own effort. The Pentagon says it has no choice but to proceed.
On March the 1st, President Putin announced a new generation of weapons vastly superior to anything developed around the world.
У России такое оружие есть.
A hypersonic system, an ICBM with unlimited range, weapons that can fly through dense layers of the atmosphere, a nuclear-powered cruise missile, underwater drones, a unique combat laser complex. That got everyone talking about an arms race and that deadly Russian missile. But from Russia's point of view, it's the one that feels threatened and wants to restore nuclear parity. So how does that work? And what did Putin mean when he said,
Нас никто не слушал. Послушайте сейчас.
Yeah, let's take a look at it, Ryan. It's called the Avant-Garde Missile System, and it's called a system because what we're really talking about here is a hypersonic glider that you put on top of an ICBM to launch it into space and then get it closer to your target. It flies about 20 times the speed of sound. Some estimates have it up at Mach 27, incredibly fast, can carry a nuclear warhead. And the real scary thing about this is that as it closes in on its target, it can independently zig and zag and to avoid missile defenses. The Pentagon, for their part, they are still working on hypersonic systems of our own, but it doesn't look like we're going to have a hypersonic system in development, or at least in the field, for at least 2 to 4 years from now. So the Russians are ahead of us on this. The other problem with this missile system is that our radar systems, according to the acting Secretary of Defense, Patrick Shanahan, are not strong enough, not capable enough of detecting it far enough away because of the speed. So this is a real worry, and it's got the Pentagon planners, I'm sure, working very, very hard. There's another system, an underwater system that the Russians are working on and that Putin has been bragging about. It's called the Poseidon. It is a nuclear-powered, that's right, it's a torpedo with a nuclear reactor in it that can also carry nuclear warheads. It is very long range, up to about 6,000 miles. It can travel at depths of up to 3,000 feet, and it's very fast. Somewhere the estimates are between 55 and 100 knots, 55 to 100 miles an hour underwater. The idea for this weapon is to go after large ships like aircraft carriers or shore installations. And again, this is not a system for which we have adequate defenses right now. Very worrisome. This is in testing right now, not in the fleet, not as far along as the Avant-Garde. Now look, the Russians have also been doing a lot of military buildup and increasing their capabilities throughout the whole year. Back in March, they tested a new intercontinental ballistic missile called the Satan II, which can carry up to 26 independently targeted warheads, re-entry vehicles, if you will, 10 of them of a large size. In September, back in the fall, they did war games with China. Now, these war games in the East have typically been done to deter China. They've been about sort of making sure China knew not to mess with Russia. This year, they worked with China to send a message to the West and to the United States in particular. Back in October, of course, they've now, using satellite imagery, we've been able to tell they've been upgrading military installations in Kaliningrad on the Baltic Sea, right on the doorstep of NATO. And then in November, they tested a satellite system called the Nesting Doll. Now, what's really interesting about this is not so much the actual satellite itself, but the little satellite that comes out that it puts into space outside of it. Now, the Russians will tell you this is about being able to work on satellites, that this little guy is meant to go fix and repair other satellites that they have in orbit, but the Pentagon is worried that what it could be is actually a targeting mechanism to go after Western satellites, either with lasers or maybe even to crash into them. So the Russians have been very busy this year. This is going to be certainly on the plate of Pentagon planners and the new Secretary of Defense, whoever that ends up being, well into 2019.
A mysterious Russian satellite is sounding the alarm bells at the State Department. Officials are warning the international community has no way to tell if a satellite could be used as a weapon. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby has the details from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Officials here say the Russian satellite is behaving unlike anything they've seen before. Russia insists it is not hostile, but the U.S. is calling on the United Nations to enact stricter measures for what it can and cannot be placed into orbit.
We don't know for certain what it is, and there is no way to verify it.
State Department Assistant Secretary Yelena Poblete is raising serious questions about a mysterious Russian satellite at the United Nations in Geneva.
How do we verify what countries say their spacecraft are doing? What would be enough information to prove what the purpose of an object is?
Poblete says the U.S. has been monitoring the satellite since its launch in October of last year. The State Department doubts the Russian claim that it's a small inspector spacecraft. In Brazil, Defense Secretary James Mattis pushed for greater defense of U.S. satellites against threats like Russia and China.
So we have had to do a lot of work defining the problem. It has to do with 10, 20 years in the future. Where do we want to be? What is our economic dependence on space? What is our intelligence? What do we have to do if we have to make it defensible instead of just putting up satellites in a benign environment?
Mattis, who's on a diplomatic tour in South America, is also emphasizing the U.S. interest in partnering with Brazil in space research, an area in which China has shown growing influence. Some say the U.S. is playing up the Russian satellite to bring attention to the militarization of space. The Trump administration has been pushing to create a space force, but has yet to get congressional backing to form what would be an expensive sixth branch of the military. Throughout the week, Secretary Mattis has downplayed U.S. plans to put weapons in space, but he's emphasizing the vital role of satellites, not just in military operations, but in the world economy. That includes phone communications, GPS navigation, and weather information.
Tonight, new concerns inside the U.S. defense community over a Russian military satellite exhibiting some very strange behavior. Our Brian Todd is on the story for us. Brian, why are officials keeping an eye on this particular piece of equipment? It's very interesting.
It is, Jim. They're doing that because this satellite seems to have done something that U.S. officials admit they have never seen before. It has birthed two other satellites, according to experts, and they're worried the Russians could use it as a weapon in space. Blasting off from a Russian cosmodrome, a Soyuz rocket surges into space. Its payload, a military satellite shrouded in mystery. That was in June of last year. Tonight, space and military analysts are investigating whether that satellite is the same one, which a top U.S. arms control official said this week was exhibiting, quote, abnormal behavior.
When you look at the entire Russian catalog, this satellite and its children are the ones that jump out as the ones that are acting in an unusual way.
The satellite's children? Experts at the firm Analytical Graphics, who've analyzed this satellite, believe the larger Russian satellite, quote, birthed a smaller satellite a couple of months later. Then, a couple of months after that, the smaller Russian satellite birthed an even smaller satellite.
almost like a Russian nesting doll.
The Russian Ministry of Defense even announced the first berthing, saying the smaller satellite would, quote, inspect the condition of the larger one. But experts are worried the Russians could be testing it out for military purposes.
The fact that it's the MOD announcing it, the Ministry of Defense announcing that, and it's a secret mission, clearly that's, even if it's a test satellite, it's got some kind of military purpose in what it's testing.
What kind of military purpose? The Pentagon and U.S. Air Force Space Command won't say specifically what they believe the Russian satellites could do. But tonight, a U.S. military official tells CNN the Russians and other adversaries have turned space into a, quote, war-fighting domain.
You could see the evolution of that technology in that a single satellite could then sort of give birth to multiple smaller satellites, which would principally be potentially kinetic weapons. Of course, we're thinking later on to the future.
This possible threat is one reason why the Trump administration has been pushing so hard for a so-called Space Force. U.S. military officials have told CNN the Russians have already developed a satellite called Cosmos 2499. They've nicknamed it Kamikaze because they say it could at some point have the capability to go on the attack and slam into American satellites. Experts say the Russians could use satellites to jam American satellites, intercept or disrupt crucial communications.
A lot of our image surveillance reconnaissance means are space-based, so it's really more the United States' ability to see in support of its forces that potentially is threatened.
The Russians are flatly denying the U.S. assertion that they're trying to weaponize satellites.
Ничего нового мы не услышали.
The same unfounded, slanderous accusations based on suspicions, on suppositions, and so on and so forth.
In denying that they have weaponized satellites, the Russians are again pressuring the Americans to join a treaty that would ban weapons in space. The U.S. government has resisted joining that treaty, saying there's no way to verify that Russia and China are curtailing their weapons, and U.S. officials say the treaty has too many loopholes to allow those countries to actually build their weapons capability. Jim, looks like we have a genuine arms race in space going on right now.
Tonight, new details emerging on the escalating military tensions between the U.S. and Russia. As Pentagon officials game out a response to Russian aggression in Europe, Vladimir Putin is now making some serious moves in the Caribbean. Our Brian Todd is all over the story for us. Give us the latest, Brian.
Wolf, tonight, Putin is on America's doorstep with nuclear-capable bombers that can fly at twice the speed of sound. It's a bold move right out of the Cold War as the Russian president tries to establish a military foothold near American shores. A Russian bomber with an impressive wingspan touches down at America's doorstep. The Tu-160 has to deploy parachutes to slow down. Russian pilots, decked out in helmets and orange jumpsuits, climb out to a hero's welcome. Two of these bombers, nicknamed Blackjacks, are in Venezuela tonight. Vladimir Putin has deployed these warplanes, along with two support aircraft, to conduct exercises over the Caribbean with Venezuelan forces. A worrisome development for Washington, considering the capability of the Russian bombers, which can fly twice the speed of sound.
This bomber was designed to do both high-altitude and low-altitude penetration of airspace with nuclear weapons, to deliver nuclear weapons on target. This aircraft was designed to be an offensive-capable weapon to get into our airspace during the Cold War.
The deployment comes on the heels of Putin's recent military aggressions against Ukraine on land and sea, and countermoves by U.S. forces. Analysts say Putin is sending an unmistakable signal to the United States tonight.
He's clearly trying to send a message to the United States that he can play in our backyard and that Russia maintains significant military capabilities.
Another concern tonight is the Cold War-style alliance of two strongmen who are both antagonists of the U.S. Putin and Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, who visited Moscow just last week. Experts say U.S. military and intelligence officials are closely watching the Putin-Maduro partnership and how it may work against American interests close to American shores.
They have a close military relationship. Russia does provide Venezuela with significant military support. Usually with these close military relationships, a close intelligence relationship is part of that.
The Russian deployment comes as Venezuela is deep in crisis, triggered by plummeting oil prices, crippling economic mismanagement, and violent protests against Maduro. U.S. officials tonight are skewering Putin and Maduro. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeting, "The Russian and Venezuelan people should see this for what it is. Two corrupt governments squandering public funds and squelching liberty and freedom while their people suffer." Putin's spokesman fired back.
It's probably not very appropriate to make such statements when you were a country with a military budget so big that half of it could feed the whole continent of Africa.
Analysts say none of this will stop Vladimir Putin from once again trying to gain a Russian foothold in America's hemisphere.
Putin has made it very clear through his actions and through his commentary that he intends to reestablish Russia to the level of influence of the Soviet Union.
Now, just a short time ago, Venezuela's foreign minister leveled his own broadsides at the U.S., calling Mike Pompeo's tweet, quote, disrespectful and cynical. He pointed out that it was President Trump who publicly threatened military intervention against Venezuela. Now, analysts say we can expect military cat and mouse games to continue while those Russian bombers are deployed in Venezuela. They say U.S. forces will almost assuredly send out surveillance planes, possibly vessels, to shadow the Russians and Venezuelans. Pentagon officials will only tell CNN that they are monitoring these exercises. Wolf?
And Brian, that will potentially give the Venezuelans and the Russians some intelligence of their own, right?
Absolutely, Wolf. Experts say as U.S. planes and ships monitor these joint Russian-Venezuelan exercises, and the Russians and Venezuelans, well, they're going to gather intelligence on the Americans, on their spying and shadowing capabilities, and try to figure out how to evade them. This is the kind of cat and mouse that goes on, but it can turn dangerous in a blink.
To Russia. It's the country's version of the State of the Union. Today, President Vladimir Putin made his annual speech to Parliament. And as expected, there were plenty of references and direct threats to the United States and the West in general.
The halls were packed, and the look was new. But in his State of the Nation address, President Vladimir Putin railed against a familiar old adversary. He warned the United States that it should not try to deploy nuclear weapons in Europe, because if it did, there would be consequences.
Russia will be forced to create and develop weapons which can be used not only towards those territories from which direct threats may be directed at us, but also towards those territories where centres of decision-making in employing rocket systems that are threatening to us.
And this could be Russia's answer, a nuclear-powered submarine that can fire off underwater drones. President Putin says it will be ready within months.
In the backdrop is the crumbling of the INF Treaty. That's a Cold War-era deal to limit missiles, and with it, the threat of nuclear war. The U.S. pulled out of it earlier this month, blaming Russia for violating the terms.
NATO has responded to those comments, condemning Putin's threats as unacceptable and calling on him to focus on being compliant with the INF Treaty.
So there is that buildup happening in Russia. I should say that the United States has also talked about a buildup or modernization of its nuclear weapons. So do you fear an arms race right now? Do you fear the erosion of arms control?
Well, I fear both of those. We are entering a new arms race for sure. It reminds me of the 1970s, 1980s. What's interesting is I don't think Americans are that focused on this at this point, but it's not only the Russians that are modernizing their forces with some very capable weapons they know how to build, and maybe some fictional weapons we don't know whether they will build or not. But the Russians are clearly deciding that they want to see nuclear weapons as an important element in their policy. The Trump administration is doing the same. In fact, even under Barack Obama, the United States decided to engage in a $1 trillion plus nuclear buildup with new missile submarines, new intercontinental range ballistic missiles, new strategic bombers. So we're kind of sleepwalking into this new arms race. I don't think that either side in the near term is going to gain some important advantage. But under these conditions, we could lead to a situation where one or the other side felt that in a crisis, a serious disagreement, that the other was going to strike, and that's when, people begin to make mistakes. They make miscalculations. And the problem, secondly, is we don't have any arms control negotiations underway. And we have an important treaty, the INF Treaty, signed in 1987, which could collapse over the next year because we believe the Russians are cheating, and they claim we're not following the treaty.
Quickly, should the U.S. be concerned about this? Should Americans be concerned about these new weapons? Or should Americans also be concerned about what you call this sleepwalking into a conflict?
I think it's more of the sleepwalking problem. I think what we need to do is find a way to get back into a serious conversation with the Russians on controlling nuclear weapons. The longer we wait, the more difficult it will be, not only because both sides will have better weapons, but with these new technologies of the sort that Putin talked about today, it's gonna be a lot harder to design effective agreements to control this new arms race.
Richard Burt, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would imagine during your lifetime you've seen the rise, fall, and what potentially looks again like the rise of Russia. How is that a sign of the end time?
Putin wants to reassemble the Soviet Union. He's like a bear who's been deprived of his cubs, and he's out trying to get the cubs back. The interesting thing about Russia is that there are 2 chapters in the book of Ezekiel that tell the whole story of Russia's future. And it's one of the most profound sections of the Word of God, and it is the most detailed description of war found in the Bible. The Bible calls Russia the king of the north and talks about the fact that in the end time they're going to bring a coalition of nations together and come after Israel when Israel's resting in the security of a covenant she's made with the Antichrist. And it's going to look like Israel is finished, dead, and then God is going to intervene. And if you read Ezekiel 38, 39, it's unbelievable. One of the great stories. There's going to be, in the end time, a coalition of nations led by Russia and Iran. They're going to come together and they're going to attack Israel. All of these nations coming from the north, this incredible coalition of armies is going to come against Israel. So Israel is going to be attacked by this coalition from the north, because they want Israel's land, they want Israel's wealth, and they want to slaughter Israel's people. There is an inherent hate in the hearts of many people toward the Jewish people. As a cloud covers the land with its shadow, so the armies of the Russian alliance will cover the land of Israel. And what happens next is one of the most astounding stories in the Bible. A deluge of fire and brimstone will fall on Russia and her allies, just as God rained down fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. And the victory that God wins on behalf of his people will be the most astounding thing that has ever happened on this earth. And God himself will get the glory. And there will be no doubt about who saved Israel.